The Bridge, the Mindbridge Trilogy, Book 1. Written by Joe Luegers. Narrated by Alaxandra Luegers. For July Lana Luegers, Our Frost Flower. Chapter 21. Twofold. The Ragged Mountains. Thane moved to attack the nomadic woman, but Jonathan quickly pulled him back. "She can send you right over an Oahu volcano with one touch, boy," the artist said. "Stay away." Kaya stood as still as she possibly could, but her eyes were wide with fear. "You have to listen to me," said Tamala. She spoke quickly, but with a calm determination. "Link hands." "You think we're stupid?" asked Jonathan fiercely. "Listen to me," shouted Tamala. "Jasper has been sighted on the road to the capital. If you link hands, I will send you to him." "How can we trust you?" asked Marin. Max floated up off of Marin's shoulder and looked closely at Tamala's face. "She shows no micro-expressions of deception," said Max. "If anything, she looks extremely confused, and for some reason, she can't take her eyes off of me." "Probably because she's not used to seeing a floating metal thing that talks," commented Fane. "And I can't say that—" "You're running out of time," Tamala interrupted. "If the other nomads come to investigate, all will be lost, and I can no longer assist you. I must maintain their trust. Find your father and the other Monhegans and tell them to get far away from the capital tonight. They will assume that you died. Link hands now." Marin stepped forward and took Kaya by the hand, squeezing tightly, and some of the fear seemed to fade from Kaya's face. Max floated over and settled on Marin's shoulder. "She could be lying," said Fane, taking a step backwards. We can't trust them. She could send us to another one of their prison camps." "Maybe," said Marin. "But if that's true, then at least we go together. If they separate us, we're weaker." Fane's arm trembled, and he held it back from the group. He looked up at Tamala, and Marin saw that he had tears in his eyes. "Your people killed our horse," he said with a trembling voice, and now tears were running down his cheeks. "But you know what? I'm glad that you captured us. I was hoping that I would get to talk to a nomad once we got to the mainland, so I could tell them how I feel about them. I want you to know that Now is not the time to throw around insults, boy," said Jonathan. "Shut up!" screamed Fane. "I have to say this." He took a step closer to Tamala and continued. His hands were balled into fists and his voice trembled as he spoke. "When I was a little kid, nomads attacked my village. My father was the guardian and they didn't expect him to be so powerful. He fought them off and they knew that they were losing. Just before they fled, a nomad fired an arrow at us as a parting shot. But they didn't aim for my father. They shot my older brother. He was the age that I am now. His name was Emrys. I watched him die. Those nomads didn't think twice about killing him. You are all animals to me." Fane reached out and grabbed Kaya's hand, never taking his eyes off of Tamala. "I'll go to whatever prison you're sending us to," he said. "But before we go, I just wanted you to know that I hate you." Kaya listened to her best friend with her heart breaking, but she turned to see that Tamala's proud expression was not pierced in the slightest. "There is so much you don't know," Tamala said. "The Western Blaze has lost their way, but they are a small drop in the ocean of our culture. If you want to paint all of us the same way and pretend I was the coward who killed your brother, fine. You are free to hate me, boy. But hating is easy. Trusting is a harder and far braver act. Jonathan, who had been the most hesitant of all, walked over and placed his hand on Fane's shoulder. "It's either this or freezing to death," he muttered. "I'll send you all at once to the Capitol Road," Tamala said. "Find Jasper and get away from the city. You never met me, and this never happened." Kaya, still standing like a statue, said her only word of the conversation. "Why?" "Many of us still remember the ancient nomadic culture," Tamala said. "Thousands have not joined Rugaru's clan. There are those who are brave enough to infiltrate his highest ranks and thwart his evil plans at every turn. The ancient nomads do not recognize the leadership of foreign tyrants, and when a tyrant begins to rise amongst ourselves..." The corner of Tamala's mouth just barely curved into a smile. "We resist," she finished. Tamala looked down at Kaya. "The true search has eyes everywhere, and now those eyes are on you, Kaya." The air around them crackled and became an unintelligible blur. Coldness gave way to a mingling of conflicting sensations, and then they were gone. The lights of the Capitol were twinkling on the horizon, and a full moon was just starting to rise in the sky. Jonathan, Marin, and Kaya found their feet hitting the solid ground of the Capitol Road. Max floated around excitedly. "I'm here," he said. "That's a relief. I was worried that her magic wouldn't work on me." "Magic?" asked Jonathan. "What does that mean?" "Don't worry about it, wizard," said Max. Fane sighed, but the tension did not seem to leave his body. "She really did it," he said. "She sent us to the Capitol. There must be some kind of trap waiting here." Kaya didn't let go of her friend's hand. "Fane, I didn't know about your brother," she said quietly. "Is there anything I can—" "I've said what I needed to say," he interrupted. Fane looked at their surroundings, and he almost seemed wounded at the fact that the woman had told the truth. She had saved them. "Guys," said Marin, "look!" She pointed across the road. In the middle of a field were a dozen tents and the light of a campfire. Familiar voices rang in the distance. "It's the Monhegans!" yelled Kaya. "Father!" She dropped Edgard's sword and bolted as fast as she could towards the campsite, with Fane following closely behind. Max snapped onto Marin's wrist, and she went after them, but hesitated after a few footsteps. Kaya and Fane disappeared into the campsite without her. "What's the matter?" asked Jonathan. "Isn't that your village?" "No," said Marin. "I'm not one of them, and I don't know what they'll make of me. It's very complicated." Jonathan eyed the metal band that was around Marin's wrist and nodded thoughtfully. "Complicated indeed," he said. "There are a lot of things going on here that I don't understand, but perhaps I don't want to understand. Now I see that I don't belong in the capital either. I have a stable outside the city. I'm going to get one of my Edgardian horses and ride to York to find my daughter. High Guardian Thomas probably believes me to be dead, and that just might be okay with me. You're welcome to tag along. The city of York is a beautiful place." "No," said Marin. "I'm going to wait by the campsite. Kaya will need some time with her father by herself." Jonathan turned to leave, but after a few seconds, he turned and gave Marin a mysterious look. "I kept waiting for the High Seven to come and save me," he said quietly. "They are the strongest relayers on the entire Western continent." heroes that stories are told of across the world. But if they had come, they would have burnt that base to the ground without any regard for an old artist. I would have never believed that my heroes would turn out to be 2 teenage girls. But it seems that I need more faith. Thank you. Jonathan turned and walked towards the stables. He thought of the daughter that he hadn't seen in all the cycles while he made his fortune in the capital, and tears ran down his cheeks. They could keep his fortune. Tonight, he had been given a gift, and he was saved in more ways than one. Kaya darted past the confused faces of the Monhegans moving around the campsite. She caught a few snippets of surprised comments as she ran. Could it be? Kaya and Fane? Spotting a light in her father's tent, Kaya swerved around the astonished villagers. Kaya pulled open the cloth door and nearly jumped inside. Fane walked in after her and stood anxiously with his eyes on his teacher. Miss Clara was sitting on the floor next to Jasper's tent. He lay with his eyes closed and his chest rose slowly as he drew rattling breaths. Miss Clara saw Kaya, sprang to her feet and hugged her arms around her. "Kaya," she cried, "is it you? Is it really you?" "Yes," said Kaya. "I'm back in my body. What are you doing here? Nomad said that they captured you." "Very briefly," Miss Clara laughed. Maddox suddenly burst into the tent and grabbed his son. "Fane!" he yelled angrily, shaking him by the shoulders. "What in desolation were you thinking? Don't you know that there's a reason we left the mainland? Use your head for once, Fane. Your impulsiveness could have killed all of us." Fane's voice trembled as he spoke, and he somehow shrank with more fear now than he had felt when facing the Hydra vine. "Dad," Fane muttered, "I know, Our family has already lost too much here," Maddox said, and then he pulled his son in close and began crying. Fane's mother Delia began speaking quietly. Kaya noticed that she sat on the other side of Jasper's bed, and a warm blue light was shining from her hands onto him. "There's no time for this," she said. "We'll have our stories soon, but time is running out. Kaya needs to say goodbye." Kaya let go of Miss Clara and bent down over her father. Black veins streaked up and down his whole body, and his eyes rolled around deliriously before locking onto his daughter. "Kai," he whispered, but did not have the strength to finish. Kaya clung to him. "How much longer?" asked Miss Clara. "I would say minutes," said Delia, "but he shouldn't have lasted this long to begin with. He won't make it through the night for sure." "What?" Kaya asked. "You don't mean—" No! We need to go to the capital and—" "He's too weak," said Delia. "Even the capital hospital couldn't help him now. We need to do the ritual of passing." "No," said Kaya again. "There must be—" She trailed off, slowly accepting the truth. There was nothing that could be done. Her father was going to die. Fane suddenly pulled himself away from Maddox and looked at Kaya with urgency. "We can't stay here," he said. "The nomadic woman said we had to leave the capital as fast as we could. They're planning something, and it's going to happen tonight." "The journey would kill Jasper faster," said Delia. "We're staying right here," said Miss Clara determinedly. "If the nomads come while my son is dying, I will destroy every last one of them." There was a sudden, uncomfortable silence in the room. Maddox and Delia looked very touched at Clara's comment. She had brought many orphans to the island when she was guardian of Monhegan. but she had never referred to them as her own children. Clara had always been a woman of action and was not the sentimental type. Kaya walked over and held her teacher's hand. "He loved you, Miss Clara," Kaya said. "There's nobody on the island that my father admired more. I hope he told you." Miss Clara's eyes glimmered. "He told me every day," she said, "as a boy and as an adult. He loved you too, Kaya. You were his whole world." Miss Clara reached into the bedside table and picked up an envelope. It was addressed to High Guardian Thomas Zieg with Jasper's shaky handwriting. "Jasper could have saved himself days ago," she said, "but he chose not to. Everything changed when he heard you had been captured. Your father almost sacrificed everything to get you back." "What's that?" asked Fane, pointing at the envelope. Miss Clara closed her fist and the letter went up in a burst of flames. "Something that the guardianship never needs to know about," said Miss Clara. She turned her attention to Fane's parents. "Gather all of Jasper's closest companions," she said. "It is time for them to pay their last respects before we do the passing ritual." "And if the nomads arrive?" asked Delia. Miss Clara picked up her walking stick and tossed it to Delia. "This will keep you safe," said Miss Clara. "It's one of the 7 artifacts that still holds Edgard's power." Delia suddenly looked very intimidated, but she nodded and exited the tent with Maddox. "I want Marin to be here too," said Kaya. "It's only right. She never meant for my father to get hurt." "What are you talking about?" Miss Clara began, but her words trailed off as she watched a red-headed teenager with a sword walk into the tent. Kaya did not even have to turn around to know that Marin was here. She had felt her coming. "That's her," said Kaya. "Marin escaped Earth when her family tried to kill me, and she saved us from the nomads' prison." Marin smiled shyly at Miss Clara. "Hello again," she said. "It's nice to meet you in person." Max flew up into the air and waved at the gawking woman. "Hi, everybody," he said. "Let's go ahead and have a moment of surprise. Yes, I am a small flying piece of metal who can talk." Miss Clara walked forward, wide-eyed, and passed right by Max without giving him a second glance. She reached forward with a trembling hand and pointed to the sword that Marin was holding. That's, Miss Clara stuttered. "No!" Kaya had never, ever seen the composure of her teacher break down like it was now. "It's the sword of Edgard Zieg," said Marin. "It was on my world. We used it to get here." She held the weapon out to the woman, and Miss Clara inspected it closely. Tears were forming in her eyes. "It always found its way back," she whispered almost inaudibly. Miss Clara turned to Kaya and stared for several uncomfortable seconds, as if struggling with indecision. "Kaya, your father never wanted you to know. He wanted you to have a normal life, but this is a sign. Your life can never be normal. The sword found you." "What are you talking about?" asked Kaya. Said Miss Clara, taking a deep sigh. "I'm your grandmother, Kaya. Jasper is my son." Kaya stared in disbelief. "No," she said. "You brought Jasper here as an orphan to start a colony for refugees." "No, Kaya. I am Clarice Zieg, Generalist Knight of the original High Seven. I never came here to start a refugee colony. That's just what it became. Edgard and I came here to raise our son." "Edgard?" asked Fane, jumping to his feet. "Hold on!" said Kaya. "Yes," said Ms. Clara. "When Jasper dies, you will be the only living descendant of the High Guardian Edgard Zieg. You will be the true heir of Edgardia, as Jasper is now. Yesterday, your father was going to confront High Guardian Thomas with his heritage and use the knights to rescue you." "Kaya, I didn't think that you could get any cooler," said Fane. "But this is amazing." "No, it's not," said Ms. Clara. "Edgard never called himself the son of Gaia. It's just what other people wanted him to be. History books turned him into little more than a story to fit their own beliefs. The entire world looked at Edgard for protection, but he was as lost as anybody else. It was maddening, and those close to him faced death threats every day. Edgard sent me to Monhegan Island and was going to disappear so that we could raise a family in secret. But Duncan killed him days before our plan could happen." Marin held her hands over her mouth, horrified and feeling suddenly nauseous. She wanted to run, to get away from here and never come back. But she was in an unfamiliar and dangerous world. "No!" Marin whispered. Fane, Kaya, and Miss Clara all turned to look at her. "It's not your fault," said Max in her earpiece. "You are not your family." The same revelation suddenly hit Kaya, and she stared at Marin with a horrible knowing. "What am I missing?" asked Fane. "I'm sorry," said Marin, holding back tears. "My family had Edgard Zieg's sword because, well, my grandfather was Duncan Casey, the crucifier." "That's impossible," said Miss Clara severely. "High Guardian Thomas found Duncan's body. The sword is buried under the castle with Edgard." "No," said Marin. "Edgard never died on Gaia. Duncan used the sword to bring him to Earth because he knew that he couldn't be healed there. My grandfather killed him, and he went on to have a family. I don't know why Thomas lied about it. Maybe he saw it as an opportunity to become High Guardian. Duncan died last year of cancer. He lived to be an old man." Miss Clara let the sword slide out of her hands and fall to the ground. She turned to look at her dying son on the cot and then stared at Marin with an unfathomable expression. "That's," said Miss Clara, but her voice caught in her throat. She took a trembling breath and averted her eyes from Marin before continuing. "Please excuse me for a moment." The old woman walked quickly out of the tent. In the uncomfortable silence of the room, they could hear Miss Clara's restrained crying. Kaya and Fane looked at the floor as Marin searched for an accepting face. "I don't belong here," Marin said finally. "I didn't mean to cause your family more harm." She picked up Edgard's sword and gently placed it next to Jasper's sleeping body. It gave off a faint glow, as if recognizing its master. Marin turned and walked towards the tent's exit. Max silently rejoined her wrist as she reached to open the swaying cloth. "Twofold," said Fane. Marin hesitated. "What?" she asked. "That's what the Hydra Vine said before it let us go," said Fane. "And another vine said the same thing before it poisoned Jasper. I've been thinking about it a lot." What does this have to do with anything? Asked Kaya. There's an old saying, Fane continued. The Hydravine pays twofold, so be careful what you toll. I understand it now. We wandered into a Hydravine's territory while it was gathering food for its children, and it poisoned Jasper because it could sense our own fear and hate. But then, whenever we helped a Hydravine and showed it kindness, it destroyed a whole nomadic base and let us go. When you give it fear, it gives you double. And when you give it freedom, it does the same for you. Fane walked over to Marin and gently wrapped his arms around her in a comforting hug. I can't hate you, Marin, he said. Hating is too easy and it comes back double. Tamala was right. You can't control your family's past. Marin put her face onto his shoulder and wept freely. All of the guilt and anger over her family was coming out now. I know, she cried, but I can't pretend that the past doesn't matter either. There is so much pain here because of my family. I have to find some way to fix this. You can't fix it, said Kaya weakly. The Hydra poison divides in the blood and it has spread too far. We have to accept that my father is going to die. It's like cancer, said Max suddenly. Dividing? Cancer cells! Marin looked up, wiped her tears, and saw that the old sword of Edgard Zieg had begun to glow even brighter next to Jasper. She gasped as a thought struck her. I know why I'm here, said Marin. I know why Gaia brought us together. Chapter 22. Kindling. The Capital Road. Kaya and I aren't linked in spite of our family's violent past, but because of it, said Marin. Gaia's pulling us back together to fix what we've broken. Can Gaia do that? Asked Kaya. Well, it depends on your religious views, said Fane. Some branches teach that Gaia is an actual living being, while others believe that it is a cosmic energy field which harnesses the spirits of everyone who has ever lived. Everyone looked at Fane, surprised that he had said something so insightful. What? He asked. Oh, wow, Fane knows a thing. I'm Miss Clara's best student, you dummies. Whatever Gaia is, it's real, said Max. It preserved my mind and brought me straight to Marin so that I could help her get here. Jasper is dying because of me, said Marin, but I might be the only person who can save him. My dad told me that he was working on a cure for cancer. He said that it was nearly finished. Cancer cells divide, so his medicine would divide at the same rate as the cells and destroy them. It's exactly like the Hydra poison. Max, do you think that you can find where the medicine is locked up? I downloaded the Mother Tech files earlier, said Max. The medicine is at the main headquarters in your dad's office. Is he really going to just give it to us? Asked Kaya. He literally tried to kill me earlier. I'll do whatever it takes to get the medicine, said Marin. The tent flaps suddenly rustled in the wind, and they heard a voice speak from behind them. How do you know that you can get back? Asked Ms. Clara. Marin turned around to see that the old woman had entered the tent. Her eyes were red, but she watched Marin thoughtfully. I don't know, said Marin. I can just feel it. Can't you, Kaya? Kaya nodded and looked toward the sword lying next to her father. It was glowing brighter with each second. That sword is ancient and mysterious, said Ms. Clara. Even Edgard didn't understand its nature. It saved him in every battle but his last. Merrin stepped forward and picked up the sword, letting it fill her with strength and purpose. "I have every reason not to trust you, Merrin," said Miss Clara. "But I do trust you. Please, save my son." Merrin visualized her father's office and swung the sword. Once again, it left a glowing slash mark that hung in the air ominously. There was a rip in the space in front of her, and she could see the interior of the Mother Tech building through the slash. "I'll need to leave the portal open this time," said Merrin, "just in case we need to leave quickly." A rippling succession of pops suddenly erupted outside the tent like gunfire. "The nomads!" Kaya exclaimed. "It's happening!" Ms. Clara turned to Fane urgently. "Tell the Monhegans to protect the tent at all costs," said Miss Clara. "Do as you've been taught." "Max," said Merrin, "you stay and help." "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes." "Be safe, sister," said Max, and he flew off to follow Fane. Merrin stuck Edgard's sword into the ground a few feet in front of the slash mark. Kaya leaned over and kissed her sleeping father on the forehead. "This is not goodbye," she whispered. Kaya stood up and took a deep breath and walked out of her universe. Fane looked towards the capital in horror. Dozens of nomads were rapidly bursting into existence and firing arrows at the guards on top of the capital's outer walls. The famous Edgardian archers returned fire, and their metal arrows bent through the air towards the attackers, but the nomads simply disappeared before being struck. A horn was blown, and more capital guards climbed onto its walls, holding up their arms and drawing in the power of Gaia. A great wall of fire suddenly erupted from the city, curving through the air and creating a perfect dome of flames over the capital. Max floated up to Fane and rapidly scanned the situation at the capital gates. "I'm going to try to stop as many as I can from coming near the campsite," said Max, and then charged ahead like a bullet. "Stay safe, flesh bag." Fane's father frantically ran around the corner with a group of Monhegans following closely behind, all of them pulling out weapons and readying themselves for combat. "The Western Blaze is attacking the capital," he yelled. "They're not going to leave us alone for long." Fane watched the battle with a healthy mix of amazement and fear. As more nomads and soldiers appeared, the battle spread out further on the plain and inched closer toward their campsite. Capital soldiers were climbing down the walls and joining the fight. Bursts of electricity, ice, and fire erupted into the air as the soldiers attacked. Despite the army's best efforts, the nomads were simply too fast to be struck by a single attack. "Dad!" Fane called. "Look!" Maddox turned to look towards the battle and his mouth dropped open. What had begun as a dozen nomads was now growing into the hundreds. More and more were teleporting in with each second, and the air rippled with pops as they rapidly reappeared and disappeared through the onslaught of arrows. "Protect our guardian!" yelled Maddox. "Don't let those monsters get near the tent!" The Monhegans formed a circle around the campsite. Men and women that Fane had grown up around, ordinary people with jobs like baker or herbalist, were taking on advanced fighting stances. Just the other day, Miss Clara's apprentice had chided Fane for not paying attention during math, and now here he was holding two axes that glowed with electricity. "What the hell kind of village am I living in?" Fane wondered, watching as the nice old lady that lived next door twirled a trident over her head. Fane backed up, standing closer to his father while watching the distant fighting. Nomads were scattered as far as the eye could see. There must have been thousands of them now. The entire western blaze looked to be converging here tonight. The new warriors were not just spatialists either. There were men and women of many ethnicities whom had sworn allegiance to Rigaru and gotten nomadic tattoos. Fane spotted an internalist man holding a hammer that was bigger than himself. There was also a mentalist man who simply strolled around in silence and watched as the people around him dropped to the ground, crying in agony as they clawed at something invisible on their skin. Fane told himself to avoid that man at all costs. Powerful mentalists could cause excruciating pain without laying a finger on you. The nomads turned their sights on the Monhegan campsite, and it became an all-out battle. The Conjurous Monhegans began working together to create large bursts of wind that sent the arrows flying back towards the nomads. Maddox suddenly reached up with blinding speed and caught a dagger out of the air inches from Fane's face. He squeezed his hand, and the dagger snapped in half. "Don't leave my side," Maddox commanded, "and watch out for—" The enormous internalist suddenly leapt out of the battle, soaring through the air and swinging his giant hammer. Maddox summoned all of his internalist powers and concentrated them into his chest. The hammer struck him, ringing like a massive bell, and the weapon shattered into pieces. The force of the impact sent Maddox's body flying through the air and out of sight like a cannonball. Another nomad appeared in front of Fane and reached forward. Fane dodged his touch by jumping backwards, but was simply grabbed by another attacker. The man laughed and whispered into his ear. "Better learn to fly, boy," he said. Colors flew past Fane's eyes, and he suddenly found himself teleported 200 arms into the air over the battlefield. The ground shot toward him in a rush of wind, and Fane knew that his body would be crushed if he couldn't slow down the fall. He screamed and twisted through the air, struggling to stay conscious. But at the last second, Ms. Clara's words rang in his mind. "Do as you've been taught." Fane held his hands out, pulled in as much energy as he could, and released it as a burst of wind. His body was suspended in air for a brief, disorienting moment before slamming into the ground. Fane stood up, very bruised and sore, but apparently still in one piece. He stumbled as his eyes readjusted, and he realized that the Monhegan campsite was now on the other side of the capital. A literal war was standing between him and safety. Fane had always wanted to see what the High Guardian's army was capable of, but witnessing a real battle was a horrible thing. There were agonized screams and explosions coming from all around him. The body of the capital archer fell from the outer wall and hit the ground with a lifeless thud. Fane quickly looked away, suddenly finding that he could no longer control his breathing. Fighting a battle wasn't fun. It was chaotic and desperate. He ran through the fighting bodies, using his short height as an advantage. A soldier to his left was struck in the face by a club, and wetness splattered Fane's clothes. He tried his best not to think about what had just happened. "I don't want to be here," Fane thought. "This is desolation." A blinding dome of light suddenly appeared in the middle of the battle. There was a sound like lightning striking the earth, and when the light faded, 7 warriors stood in the center of a large crater. Fane recognized them immediately as the Knights of the High Seven. They studied the scene around them without a trace of fear on their faces. Fane couldn't imagine how much fighting somebody would have to experience to be as calm as the High Seven looked. The nomads immediately teleported away from the legendary relayers to other parts of the field, choosing their battles wisely. Will Zieg, the Conjurous Knight, held his hand towards the sky, and a massive tornado of fire began descending from the clouds. The other 6 knights dispersed to different corners of the battlefield. Thane stood in awe for a moment as he watched the fire grow larger, but then realized that if he didn't move, the tornado would eventually pass right through where he was standing. Gaia, he thought. He doesn't care who that thing burns up. Thane took off running, desperately trying to find the Monhegan campsite among the chaos. Occasionally, he would see an islander and run toward them, but the nomads were grabbing people and sending them all over the place so rapidly that it was impossible to keep track of where someone might be. He ran past Ali Zieg, the spiritualist knight of the High Seven, and noticed that she appeared to be reading a book as she strolled leisurely around the soldiers. A spear flew out of the darkness and headed straight towards her. "Look out!" yelled Thane, but she didn't even glance up from her book. Right before the spear was about to strike her, an owl flew out of the sky and grabbed the weapon with its massive talons. It flew high into the air and dropped the blunt end onto the head of a nomad, knocking him to the ground unconscious. Ali kept walking and reading, apparently unaware of what had just happened. A metal orb shot past Thane, transformed into a little person, and hung in the air for a second. A nomad appeared right before the spot where Max was waiting, and in the same instant, the robot reached forward and sent a purple cloud into the man's face. The nomad became limp and toppled over, asleep. "Oh, hi, Thane," said Max. "I just realized that the nomads fix their eyes on the spot where they are about to teleport approximately 1.32 seconds before they reappear. I was able to create an algorithm that calculates their exact location within 98%. A cry came out from the fighting crowd, and Miss Clara's walking stick suddenly spun through the air on its own. Thane ran forward, jumped, and caught the stick. Thane's mind ordinarily moved too fast for him to keep up with his own thoughts, and he often regretted half the things he did. However, the moment that Miss Clara's walking stick was in his hand, his mind became crystal clear. Time seemed to slow down around him, and he could see things to the tiniest detail. Thane glanced around, taking in everything calmly. "Max," he said, "I am not sure what happened, but I'm like you now. I'm some kind of genius." "I highly doubt that," said Max. Thane held up his hand and opened it expectantly. An arrow flew out of the night, and he caught it without trying before snapping it in half. "Okay, that was impressive," admitted Max. Thane dropped the pieces of the arrow to the ground and pointed at the outer walls. The Edgardian archers stood very still and were firing their bows in every direction. "The nomads aren't attacking the archers anymore," Thane observed. "They're not trying to get into the capital." "Huh," said Max. "Sure. I noticed that too, of course." A full moon was rising in the sky, and as soon as Thane saw it, everything became clear. He remembered the strange room full of paintings at the nomadic base in the mountains. A full moon had been painted outside one of the false windows. Thane thought of Jonathan York explaining how the painting was one of the High Guardian chamber, and then he visualized the Hydravine trapped in a tank while its poison was extracted. "They're drawing all of the soldiers away from High Guardian Thomas," Thane said urgently. "Rugaru is going to teleport into the night chambers and poison him any minute now." Thane gestured towards the dome of flames that encased the capital. "Can you get me through there?" he asked. I might be able to create a protective energy field, said Max. I just need a second to think. We don't have any time. I'm already done, dummy. I needed a literal second. Max flew to the ground and became a silver disc just big enough for someone to stand on. So here's my plan, said Max. Climb aboard, jump headfirst into the chaos, save a king, and then rescue a princess or something. Don't worry, you have hardly any chance of exploding. High Guardian Thomas calmly sat in his chamber with his eyes closed, gently stroking the green stone that he wore around his neck. Enormous amounts of Gaian energy flowed through him, and he stretched his mind out in every direction through the mental realm. The old man looked through the eyes of his army, seeing the ensuing battle from 1,000 viewpoints at once. Thomas spotted one of his soldiers about to step in the path of an arrow, and he whispered in the man's mind, "Left." The soldier moved to the left, and the arrow sailed past him. Thomas smiled in satisfaction. He searched for his spatialist knight, finding him effortlessly. Elias Zieg was currently teleporting a large boulder over a group of nomads. Elias, thought Thomas. Elias perked his head up and smiled. Yes, High Guardian, he spoke aloud. If this does not end soon, please come home and teleport me to my Eurasian home. Yes, sir, said Elias. Was that the slightest bit of contempt that he sensed from his knight? Perhaps the days of trusting half-bloods was coming to a close. Thomas's mind drifted away, receding from the mental realm, and Elias's image became like mist. He took his hand off the green stone and sighed. Usually the nomads picked on small villages with weak guardians, and Thomas did his best to ignore them. They were getting bolder. Thomas stood up and took off his necklace. Relaying to this degree was leaving him feeling very drained in his old age. Thomas looked up to see that a very large man had just materialized across the room, and he recognized him at once as the leader of the Western Blaze. Rugaru was holding a bow with the string pulled taut, and he fired an arrow straight toward Thomas in the near instant of his arrival. The High Guardian may have still been able to dodge, but his concentration was abruptly torn in half when the stained glass window behind him shattered and what looked like a boy on a surfboard came flying in. Fane soared across the room, riding over the fragments of glass like a wave. The disc flew out from under his feet, liquefied and wrapped around his hand until it looked like he was wearing a metal glove. "For the princess!" Max cried out. Fane hit the ground, pulled in an unbelievable amount of energy with Max's help, and sent out a gust of wind that shattered the remaining windows. Rugaru's arrow hit the wind and spun around only inches from Thomas's face, flying straight back towards the nomad. The tip of the arrow brushed the back of Rugaru's hand and flew into the stone wall behind him. The stone sizzled and melted as the hydra poison in the tip of the arrow ate away at the wall. Rugaru looked at the scratch on his hand in disbelief and then back up at Fane with a powerful, raw anger that made the boy take a step backwards. "Twofold!" shouted Rugaru, sending spit flying through the air. All of the remaining knights from the High Seven teleported into the room and darted towards Rugaru, who sent a final threatening glare at Fane and then disappeared entirely. The High Seven all turned their attention to Fane, who for once seemed to be speechless. Max had turned back into a wristband, not wanting to add more confusion to the situation. "Well," shouted Thomas, "explain yourself, boy." "That," muttered Fane, Fane to the max." "You were supposed to say that to Rugaru," whispered Max. "Who said that?" shouted Thomas, his eyes darting around the room in a fit of paranoia. "I sense another mind in the room. Get the boy, lock him up, and interrogate him." The internalist knight, a man that was nearly twice Fane's height, suddenly leapt forward and grabbed him. "What?" asked Fane. "But I saved the High Guardian's life." "You got past my armies, the High Seven, breached the capital walls, and broke into my royal chambers," said Thomas angrily, and then pointed at his knights. "Leave no corner of this boy's mind unsearched." "That's not fair! Fane began, but was cut short by a menacing voice that spoke in his mind. "Nomads, hear me," said the voice. "This is Achak of the Western Blaze. High Guardian Thomas lives and will likely flee very soon. Turn your strength on the city walls and tear them down." The High Seven stood silently, listening to the message. Fane guessed that the entire city must be hearing this voice, and he couldn't imagine the kind of power it would take to relay a thought into so many people's minds. "Now, citizens of the capital, listen well to my message. Only one death was planned tonight. We merely fight for the land that is ours, and we only act with aggression when it is acted upon us. Our brave leader, Rugaru, has been poisoned in an unforgivable strike against our people. We will meet your aggression. We will burn the capital to the ground and kill every last citizen if your High Guardian does not surrender his life." Everyone in the room turned and stared at Fane, who suddenly wished that he could shrink to the size of Max and fly away. "Allie," said Thomas, "what do you see ahead of us? Do the nomads make it into the city?" The spiritualist knight looked up from her book distractedly, and it seemed to take her a second to realize where she was. "That depends," she said. "What day is it again?" She glanced at Fane and smiled. "Oh, hi, Fane. Have we met yet? Is this now, right now, or is it already later?" "Forget it!" screamed Thomas. "Elias, get us all out of here." The High Seven began linking arms, but the Spatialist Knight hesitated when reaching for the High Guardian. "All of us?" asked Elias. "Yes," yelled Thomas, "for my protection in case we're followed." "The situation is already bleak outside the walls, sir. If we leave, the citizens will be completely unguarded." Thomas snapped his fingers, and Elias cried out, holding his face, which had apparently been slapped by an invisible hand. "Fine," said Thomas, glancing over at the Conjurous Knight. "Will, you stay behind. If the Western Blaze makes it past the walls and wants to know who poisoned their leader, give them the boy." Rugaru appeared on a beach in the guardianship of Zedland, halfway around the world from the capital and the bloody battle that was surely ensuing. Crabs scurried away in the hot sand upon the large man's appearance. Rugaru held up his left hand and studied it for a moment. The gash on his skin where the arrow had brushed him only minutes ago was already turning black, and his fingers were twitching uncontrollably. "A child," he whispered to himself. Rugaru thought back to the day that he had returned home to find his mother murdered by an Edgardian soldier. It had awoken something in him, and by the time the sun went down, he had single-handedly found and killed every single one of the soldiers that had raided his campsite. The next day, he tracked down their families. Barely 18 cycles at the time, and already so much blood on his hands. It was the act of bravery that had elevated him to the leader of the Western Blaze, and he had been left without a single scratch. Tonight, he had become the greatest spatialist of all time, utilizing the mythical technique of teleporting to a location that you have never been to by seeing it clearly in the mind's eye. To think that within the same minute, he would be struck a blow that could easily end his life by a child, no less. Rugaru took the dagger off of his belt and began relaying energy into the muscles on his right arm. He had never known his father, the coward having run off before he was born, but his mother often said something that had become Rugaru's creed. "Kindling for the fire," Rugaru whispered. "Every strike against you is kindling for the fire, and our people will burn brighter after this day." He held the dagger firmly against his left wrist and closed his eyes. Chapter 23. True Strength. Mother Tech Headquarters, Gaia. Stepping from a tear in space, Marin and Kaya walked into Dorian's office. They darted over to his desk and began rapidly looking through the drawers. The slash mark behind them filled the room with a pale blue light, and the Mother Tech headquarters was eerily quiet compared to the muffled sounds of combat echoing from Gaia. "The medicine is in a small vial," said Marin. "Max sent a picture of it to my contacts, and the last location on record was this room." Kaya picked up a crushed soda can and tossed it aside. "All I'm finding is books and old food," she said. Marin pulled a battered sci-fi novel out of one of the drawers and threw it against the wall angrily. "Why can't he be more organized?" she said, frustrated. "There must be some sort of secret compartment." "That's it!" Marin found a framed picture of her grandfather sitting on the desk, and she gently touched the glass with her fingertip. "My father showed this to me years ago," she said. "It only responds to the DNA of someone in our family." A wooden panel on the desk slid back, and a small compartment rose to the surface. Sitting in the compartment was a vial of gleaming, silvery liquid. "That's it!" said Marin. She reached forward, but when her hand was inches from the container, it sprang into the air and shot across the room. Rosalie appeared in the doorway, looking fearfully in at Kaya. Dorian stood behind her. His eyes were sunken in, and he looked like he hadn't slept since Marin had disappeared. He held the vial of medicine in his shimmering Mother Tech glove. "Marin," Dorian said, "you brought one of them here? After everything we told you, how could you?" "We need your help," said Marin. "Kaya's father got poisoned because of me, and without that medicine, he will die." "Help?" asked Rosalie. "The Gaians are coming to us for help. Our own father disavowed his Gaian heritage because of their warlike nature. We can't fix their problems." Kaya took a confident step forward. "We're not the violent ones," said Kaya. "You almost killed me. I never did anything to you, and you tried to stop my heart." "I was doing whatever it took to save my niece's mind," said Rosalie fiercely. "That's insane," said Marin. "Kaya wouldn't hurt me." "You think that you can just bring over your friend from this other world and that's the end of it?" asked Rosalie. "Once the divide is breached, more and more people will become aware of it. There are people on Gaia who could set off every quantum bomb on Earth by simply thinking it." We will never be safe around them, and I'm not so sure that they're safe around us either. It never ends with one, Marin, Dorian agreed. Not even here on Earth. A compassionate act opens the floodgates, and then immigrants with less noble intentions will follow. It's simple history. Rosalie, you told me yourself that so much of history gets left untold, said Marin. Do you want to know what I learned on Gaia about our own history? Edgard Zieg was going to run away from the guardianship and start a family. But Duncan killed him anyway. Ever since he died, the world has been in chaos, and a terrorist group has been taking over. Kaya is his granddaughter. There was a calculating silence from Rosalie. Is this true? Asked Dorian, and Kaya nodded. Yes, she said. My father is the rightful High Guardian of the continent, but he's been poisoned. Kaya began fighting back tears. Please, help us. We've tried everything else. We can set things right, said Marin. We can make up for the suffering that Duncan caused. Rosalie shook her head. The Gaians have too many reasons to hate us, she said. This won't change anything. If they find out we're here, they will destroy this world and every last safe place to kill us. She pointed to Kaya. Leave us and don't come back. Kaya and Marin looked at each other, instantly getting a sense of what the other was feeling. No, said Kaya. Rosalie lifted her hand, and the Mother Tech glove began glowing and sparking. A white-hot ball of energy appeared in her palm. Leave us, she shouted. Marin walked up to Kaya and took her by the hand. No, said Marin. I'm trying to keep us safe, shouted Rosalie. I'll do anything to protect my family. A voice spoke from the back of the room. I understand. There were suddenly gentle footsteps coming from behind them, and Ms. Clara stepped through the glowing slash mark. She held Jasper in her frail arms, and his breaths were a slow death rattle. Clara dropped to her knees and began openly crying. Please, she cried, this is my son, Jasper. And he became my whole world when he was born. I gave up a guardianship for him, and I would destroy an army to keep him safe. But there's nothing I can do anymore. So I'm begging you, help us. I've lost too much already. I can't lose him. Please. Rosalie stared coldly at the old woman, and Dorian gave his sister a searching look. Rosalie, he pleaded. I'm sorry, brother, she said, and then she raised her voice. Sedate them! A Mother Tech drone shot into the room like a rocket and fired darts towards the Gaians. Marin screamed, closed her eyes, and held out her hand. A great fountain of energy began flowing through her body. There was a collective gasp in the room, and Marin opened her eyes to see that the darts were frozen in mid-air. Gaia was flowing through her fingertips, and she felt as if she were holding the darts with her mind. That's impossible, said Rosalie. No, said Marin. Gaia came with us when I made the opening. Don't you feel it? Dorian took a cautious step toward the blue light, reaching up and letting it touch his fingertips. Yes, he said softly. I do. Marin gently relayed the power of Gaia, turning the darts in mid-air and pointing them at Rosalie. You have to help us, said Marin. Or I don't know what I'll do. Rosalie held out her hand and sent shockwaves through the air with her Mother Tech gloves. Each of the darts exploded and sprayed fluid in every direction. Several more drones flew into the room and pointed their weapons at the Gaians, now aiming to kill rather than sedate. Rosalie held her palm towards Clara, and energy began rapidly growing in the Mother Tech glove. I can have an army of guardian angels here in minutes, screamed Rosalie. Leave! The drones began exploding one by one, bursting into hot flames and then dissolving into no more than dust. Ms. Clara had taken a step forward towards Rosalie with a ferocity in her expression that Kaya had never seen before. You think that I won't fight you with my dying son in my arms? Miss Clara asked. The entire building began shaking, and the room suddenly felt like a hurricane had materialized from thin air. Rosalie had to brace herself to remain on her feet against the screaming wind. The Mother Tech suit began spreading across her body, and the ball of energy in Rosalie's hand grew larger still. Look what you've brought into our world, shouted Rosalie. One Gaian can start an earthquake and bring this building down. Imagine what an army could do. The energy in her hand was now filling the room with a piercing heat. Why are you like this? Asked Marin. I always looked up to you, but now I know you're just too angry to see clearly. Rosalie looked at her niece, and for a fleeting second, Marin thought that she saw a trace of hesitation, but then her eyes darted to a camera in the corner of the room. It was pointed straight at Rosalie, and a little green light on its fixture blinked on and off. I don't have a choice, Rosalie said, almost inaudibly. I've never had a choice. As crazy as it felt to admit, Marin could have sworn that Rosalie was talking to someone else, someone that nobody but her could see. Kaya's voice suddenly spoke in Marin's mind. I can feel her emotions, Marin. She's not angry. Kaya stepped between her grandmother and Rosalie, stopping only inches away from the glowing ball of energy in the woman's hand. You're afraid, said Kaya, and you're looking for an enemy, because then you could take out your fear on us. She turned back to Miss Clara. We can't give her the enemy she's looking for, grandmother, said Kaya. The intensity in Miss Clara's face slowly drained away, and she nodded in understanding. The building abruptly stopped trembling, and the wind ceased blowing. Kaya turned back to look at Rosalie, but the woman did not lower her Mother Tech glove. We're not going to fight you, said Kaya, but we're not leaving either. Kill me if you have to. You've already tried once. I don't hate you for that. I just want your help. Rosalie's arm trembled, but the ball of energy remained pointed at Kaya. Please, Rosalie, pleaded Marin. Help us. I thought you were strong. Dorian suddenly spoke up, walking slowly toward the confrontation. No, she's not, said Dorian. Your aunt's afraid like I am. I can feel it too, but I'm done letting fear guide me. He looked at Kaya and gave a weak smile. True strength is asking for help from those that you have every reason to hate. Rosalie, this young woman is strong in ways that you will never be. Dorian turned around and gently took Jasper's body from Miss Clara. He held the dying man in his arms and looked down at his face. Jasper's eyes opened weakly and met Dorian's. "I'm Dorian Casey," said Dorian. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I believe our fathers knew each other." Dorian looked up at Miss Clara and smiled. "I worked desperately on this medicine to save my father," he said. "But he was an old man, and I was fooling myself in thinking that he could live much longer. Maybe I was making it for you all along. I can't make any promises. The medicine has proven too strong in all of the tests, but I will try my best. Come with me." He turned around and walked past his sister without a second glance. Rosalie's cold eyes never left the Gaians, and the ball of energy remained sizzling in her hand as they walked past. One by one, each of them left the room. And one by one, Rosalie let them go. Rosalie lowered her hand, and the glowing ball of energy dispersed. In the silence of the office, she looked from the slash mark in the air to the photograph of her father on the desk. Marin was right. She could feel Gaia's presence. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but something was wrong about it. The sensations coming from the other side of the opening were horrible and desolate. "The suffering of an entire world," she said. "Is this what you wanted? Is this what you predicted?" Silence was the only response. The guilt-free image of Duncan the Crucifier smiled at her mockingly from the photograph. Rosalie took off her MotherTech glove and threw it across the room in anger. The security camera in the corner swiveled and watched her actions. "You're on your own," Rosalie said. A deep voice spoke quietly from the speakers in the room. "Desolation draws closer on the branches, Rosalie, especially after what you just let happen. The devourer of worlds does not care about or even comprehend your compassion. You must—" "I'm invisible," Rosalie interrupted, and the voice was immediately silenced. The light on the camera turned from green to red. The Capitol's walls were falling. Once Achak had carried the news of their leader's injury, every single nomad had turned to attacking the structure itself. Thousands of warriors fired lightning, heaved boulders, and struck the stones of the wall with their bare fists as the entire capital trembled. The dome of fire was now flickering out as the Conjurous guards on the wall were struck down one by one. Edgardian soldiers dwindled as the nomads teleported them to every corner of the globe. Some of the soldiers simply ran, knowing that the High Guardian and his knights had chosen to save themselves. Maddox Monhegan found his partner sprawled out on the abandoned battlefield, clutching at her leg and crying out as blood soaked through her pants. "Maddox!" she screamed. "I lost Clara's walking stick and I can't find Thane! Our son's gone!" Maddox picked up his injured partner and trembled as he stared at the chaos erupting at the capital. "It's over, Delia," he cried. "Edgardia has fallen. We need to gather the Monhegans and leave the continent. Thane has to be alive somewhere. He has to be." Delia looked towards the sky, and a strange look spread over her face. The stars were blinking out one by one, and the moon had completely disappeared. The temperature dropped rapidly as black storm clouds materialized in the sky. There was a sound like the world splitting in two, and thousands of lightning bolts streaked across the clouds, arching in the same direction. The spiderwebs of electricity converged upon a single point in the sky over Edgardia and cast the silhouette of a man into the churning heavens. A figure floated in midair, holding his sword erect as the electricity of 100 thunderheads surged through the weapon. The man seemed to glow like a star, and his hair whipped wildly in the wind as he cast his eyes down at the chaotic battle. Nearly every single nomad and Edgardian soldier dropped their weapons and ceased fighting as they saw the great figure floating through the sky. "Stop!" he called. The sound shook the ground and silenced the insects for stretches in every direction. His voice pierced through the veil of the mental realm and echoed in the minds of 1,000 fighters like an explosion. Men and women began kneeling to the ground and crying aloud, "Son of Gaia! Edgard has returned!" Delia and Maddox exchanged a look of understanding. "No," she said. "It's not Edgard, it's Jasper," finished Maddox. "Our guardian." Jasper pointed his father's sword at the battlefield, and patterns of light flew from its tip, spiraling in fractals towards the ground. Hundreds of nomads blinked away at once as they fled the scene, while those incapable of spatialist relaying simply ran screaming. The grass beneath their feet began growing like hydra vines and snaked around the bodies of the fleeing warriors. The points of light struck thousands of nomads simultaneously, and they all fell to the ground unconscious. Jasper floated to the ground in the center of a ring of cheering Monhegans. Kaya, Marin, Ms. Clara, and Dorian stood amongst the rapturous crowd with tears in their eyes. Soldiers from the Edgardian army began running for the campsite, calling out for their savior. "Son of Gaia! Edgard!" Jasper took a few trembling steps forward, mostly ignoring the shouting behind him. Kaya wanted to run to her father, but she simply stood in awe of him. His voice spoke quietly in her head. "I've missed you, Kaya." Jasper glanced at the hundreds of approaching soldiers and then back at the Monhegans. The entire group had suddenly become quiet, everyone wondering what in the world was about to happen next. It was as if they could feel history itself about to branch one way or the other. "I suppose this is it," said Ms. Clara, breaking the reverent silence. "This is when everything changes. Those soldiers believe you are the son of Gaia, Jasper, and from this moment on, the entire world will—" Jasper's eyes widened, and he held up a hand to silence her. "Is that what they think?" he asked. He scratched his cheek in thought for a second before decisively proclaiming, "No thanks." Jasper swung his sword to the ground, and a dome of light shot up around the campsite. The air around them began to ripple and glow as the surrounding battlefield turned to mist. The calls of the soldiers suddenly became faint as more familiar sounds came into the foreground. Wind. Waves crashing against the rocky shores. The crowd recognized their new location at once. The entire campsite and all the villagers had been teleported back to Monhegan Island in a single stroke of relaying. Jasper dropped his sword, wiping the sweat dripping from his hair, and looked around at all of the surprised faces. "Well, that was something," he said with a weak smile. "I sure could go for a nap and a big slice of—" Jasper took a step forward and then abruptly collapsed into the soft grass, snoring loudly. Chapter 24. The Frost Flower. The Capital Prison. Thane leaned against the dirty wall of the prison. Max had snuck away nearly 2 hours ago to get help, and the boredom would have nearly driven Thane crazy if it weren't for the amazing things that he had seen out of his cell window. A man in the sky had stopped the largest battle since the Gaian global wars, and Thane heard whispering in the hallways about how Edgard Zieg had returned. But Thane knew the truth. Maren and Kaya had done it. They had saved Jasper and returned the sword to its rightful owner. A guard walked up to the cell and sneered in at Thane. "I brought your breakfast," he laughed, rolling a plain potato under the door and into the dirt. "Is that all you have on the menu?" asked Thane. "I'm a little potatoed out at the moment. Since I saved the world and everything, surely I deserve at least a carrot or something." The man slammed his fist against the bars of the cell and gave Thane an angry look. "Don't you backtalk me, boy," yelled the guard. "You have no idea how much trouble you're in. I could snap you in half without even—" He stopped in mid-sentence and stood there without moving a muscle. His mouth hung open and drool dripped down his chin. Said Thane. "Mr. Guard, are you okay?" The guard was absolutely frozen in place. Thane walked to the door of the cell and was about to poke him when High Guardian Thomas came around the corner, followed by Ms. Clara. "Don't worry about the guard, boy," said Thomas. "He won't even remember you were here after I let you go." Thane smiled at his teacher. "I did it, Miss Clara," he said. "I stopped and thought about my actions for once, and I saved the High Guardian's life." Miss Clara shot an angry look at her old friend. "Yes," she said severely, "and I'm sure he's rather thankful for it." Thomas simply stared back at her. "Well, they did lock me up in a pretty nice cell," said Thane. "Dinner could have been better, though." Miss Clara took a step toward the High Guardian and poked him in the chest with her walking stick. "You know, Thomas," she said, "I didn't want to believe the stories about you fleeing the castle on the night Edgard died, but I'm having an awfully hard time not thinking the worst about you right now." "Cut me some slack, Clarice," said Thomas. "I thought you were dead for the last 40 cycles. Tonight, a nomad breached the capital's defenses. I was saved by a teenager flying on some metal thing, and now people are saying that Edgard himself stopped the battle. Could that have been your little boy, I wonder? What do you expect me to do? Act like my world hasn't been rocked in the last hour?" Miss Clara whacked the High Guardian on the back of the head with her stick. "I expect you to thank him," she commanded. "Yes, Miss Clara," he muttered. Thomas turned to Thane and gave him a fake smile. "Thank you for saving my life, Thane. You are free to go." Thomas took out a key and unlocked the cell. Miss Clara took Thane by the arm and began walking with him down the hallway. She suddenly stopped and glanced back at the High Guardian. "I can feel you prying at the edges of my mind, Thomas," she said. "Yes, that was my son that you saw tonight. My son, and the son of Edgard. true High Guardian. Thomas's eyes became suddenly very wide. That's right, said Ms. Clara. So I suggest you get your slimy fingers off that gem and leave my mind alone. You leave us alone, and we will leave you alone. Thomas's hand quickly sprang back from the stone he wore around his neck as if reprimanded by his own mother. He nodded grimly and watched as his old companion departed. Just before Miss Clara turned the corner, the High Guardian called to her. Members of my army reported that many of their lives were saved by a group of civilians, he said. Men and women came out of nowhere and fought with skills that surpass many of my best trained soldiers. Would you know anything about who these people were? Miss Clara smiled. I would imagine that wherever they're from, they have a very good teacher, she said, and then walked out of sight. As soon as Miss Clara departed, the frozen guard sprang back to consciousness. Without even breaking a sweat, said the guard, and then looked around in confusion. He kicked at the potato on the floor with his foot and then jumped when he saw Thomas standing right behind him. High Guardian, he exclaimed. I was just talking to... Well, honestly, I'm not quite sure anymore. I suppose I was talking to that potato. My head seems to have gotten fuzzy. Thomas patted him on the back and walked off. Carry on, young man, said the High Guardian. We both need some sleep. Monhegan Island. Mirren, look, cried Dorian. I'm doing it. He held out his hand and a tiny pebble was hovering in the air in front of him. Thane looked at it and gave a big smile to the man. Amazing, sir, he said. I'm a regular Dumbledore, agreed Dorian. Dad, said Mirren, they don't understand our cultural references here. Still not gonna stop making them, said Dorian, flying the stone in zigzags around his head. A High Guardian in the making if I've ever seen one, said Thane. A true inspiration to relayers everywhere. Ouch! Kaya had poked Thane in the ribs with her elbow, and they both started laughing. The whole group had slept for half the day in the cabins of Monhegan and then eaten an exotic feast with the entire village as they traded stories from their two worlds. Now the sun was sinking in the sky, and an entire day had passed since the battle outside Edgardia's walls. Max sat on Ms. Clara's shoulder and was engaged in a heated philosophical discussion about one of the books from her library. Kaya and Thane were trying to teach Mirren and her father the basics of relaying. Maybe you're not an externalist, said Kaya, flicking the pebble out of the air while Dorian frowned. I've heard that Duncan was an amazing internalist. Yeah, Dad, said Mirren. Try relaying some energy into your body, and I'll hit you with a big stick to see if you can block the impact. She grabbed a stick from the ground and began chasing her dad around the hillside. Jasper came walking up from the village, yawning and rubbing his eyes behind his glasses. It's the wizard himself, said Dorian. How many naps is that today? Kaya ran up and hugged her father. I have lost count, said Jasper. I did enough relaying yesterday to last a lifetime. The sword woke me up. It started glowing again, just as bright as the first time I saw it. Strange, said Dorian. I was just thinking that we needed to go back to, well, Earth. Maybe the sword read my mind. Could it be that we found some sort of magic sword? Go? Asked Mirren. This is the first time I've gotten to experience Gaia without being locked in a jail or on the run from a carnivorous plant. I know, said Dorian, but I've got 4,000 employees wondering where I am, and I'm worried that your aunt might smash my bass guitar collection if we stay away too long. Besides, I'm looking forward to my retirement. Dorian looked around and breathed in the fresh air of Gaia. Maybe we'll do some traveling, see the world. Worlds, Marin corrected him. See the worlds. Jasper retrieved his father's sword and met them on the hillside, offering the weapon to Marin. No, she said, it's not mine. I don't know if it will respond to me like it did yesterday, said Jasper. Everything that happened in Edgardia is a blur now. There's only one way to find out, said Max. Jasper closed his eyes and visualized the world where his life had been saved. The sword glowed bright. Jasper pointed it ahead of him, and a great big hole split open in the fabric of the world near the edge of the cliff. Dorian, Marin, and Max gathered their things and stood before the gateway to Earth. All of the Monhegans that they had met gathered around to say their goodbyes. Dorian held out his hand to shake Jasper's, but Jasper grabbed Dorian with his massive arms and pulled him into a hug. "Don't break me, strong man," cried Dorian, and Jasper let go. "Thank you for all that you've done for my family," said Jasper. "Oh, well, I'm not so sure that I deserve your thanks. If anything, I hope that you can forgive me and my father." Miss Clara walked up to Dorian and gripped his hand firmly. "We can't forget what is in the past," said Miss Clara, "but things have changed. I can't believe that I'm saying this, but I'm glad that Duncan got to have a family. Caring for someone changes your perspective, and I'm sure that he became something totally different from the man I knew all those cycles ago." "Dorian," asked Max, "is it okay if Fane comes over to our universe to play sometimes?" "Wow," said Dorian, "that is a really interesting question." "Would it even be possible?" Marin asked to the group. "I mean, we did what we were brought here to do. We fixed what was broken, didn't we? Will Gaia keep us linked together?" "Yep, we're heroes," said Max. "Although we did start all the problems in the first place, but isn't that the American dream?" "No," said Miss Clara. "You were given an opportunity to set things right, and both of you could have ignored it." "But do you think that Gaia's done with us?" asked Marin, suddenly feeling very melancholy. "I mean, we have Gaia in our blood. This is our real home. I can't imagine never talking to Kaya again." Kaya's voice spoke in Marin's mind. "I don't think we have a choice about that one, city girl." Marin smiled and approached the gateway to Earth with Max and her father. Max turned to see all of the emotional looks on the Gaians' faces. "I guess that in the end, friendship was the real bridge," said Max. Miss Clara raised an eyebrow. "What the heck is that thing talking about?" she asked. "Somebody has to sum up our whole adventure in a shallow way," said Max, "and nobody's seen more bad movies than me." Nearly 100 blank expressions looked back at the robot. "Okay," said Max. "How about poisoning a stranger's father can be the start to a wonderful adventure?" Let's leave before you embarrass yourself anymore, said Marin, taking the little robot by the hand. Monhegan Island. Kaya sat at the edge of the cliff where she had first met Marin, and there was a glazed overlook in her eyes. Snow drifted from the sky and was lit by the light of a half moon. Thane jumped from the trees and relayed a small snowball at Kaya. It splashed her in the face, but she simply sat motionless. Kaya? He asked, gently shaking her shoulders. Are you in this universe? Alertness came into Kaya's eyes, and she smiled upon seeing Thane. Hey, Thane, she said, but then frowned. Why is my face wet? I honestly have no idea, said Thane. What have you been up to? Marin and I were just watching a movie. Any good? He asked. Kaya said, concealing a smile. Really? I promise not to be jealous. Oh my gosh, it was amazing, Kaya exclaimed. People were flying in machines through the stars and having battles with sticks of light. I wish I could have been there. It's okay. Tomorrow, I'm going to show Marin the electric lobsters on the south side of the island if you want to come. Oh, by the way, Max says hi. Thane tried to smile, but he couldn't fake it anymore. His conflicting feelings had been getting worse over the past few months, and he had to come clean to Kaya. Kaya, he said, is this how it's going to be forever? What do you mean? Asked Kaya. Is this about Marin? You're still my best friend. I know that, he said, turning slightly red in the cheeks. I'm not jealous. I think Marin's amazing, and I'm glad that we can still talk to her. It's just... He sighed, gently reaching over and taking Kaya by the hand. Things are so good now, said Thane. Your dad's alive, Miss Clara's been a lot nicer to us, and we have 2 new amazing friends from another universe who are teaching us all these interesting things, and... Thane teared up, and Kaya scooted closer to him. I used to take things like this for granted, he said. And the old me would have thought that this could last forever, but on the mainland, everything was horrible. Those nomads killed that nice man's horse without hesitating. I saw people dying and falling from the Edgardian walls. One of the soldiers next to me got hit by a club and his blood got on my clothes. Any of those people could have been me, Kaya, or my parents, or you. My brother never got to be this happy. Thane was now openly crying. Do you think that these things will stay away from the island forever? He asked. My father will protect us, said Kaya. This is the safest place on Gaia. Your father is my hero, said Thane. But a single thorn almost killed him, just like the Hydra poison probably killed Rugaru. Heroes aren't supposed to die. Do you think we can really be the only ones that know about this secret world for our whole lives and that nobody will ever find out? That there will never be any consequences? Kaya took all of this in, but she had no response. With all of the excitement in discovering a new world, the consequences of their actions had simply not been a consideration. I just know that I'm happy now, Thane, she said. Constantly worrying about what happens next, that's no way to live. I don't know if things will stay like this forever, but maybe that makes moments like this more important. Not less. Fane wiped his eyes and smiled. I should go, he said. I made some conjurous vultures angry earlier, and they've been circling my cabin for the last hour. He took a few steps toward the village, but hesitated. There was something that he desperately wanted to say, but he lacked the courage to do it out loud. Fane simply thought the words as hard as he could, hoping that Kaya would hear his message in the mental realm. I meant it, Kaya. Kaya turned around and looked at him. Fane? She asked. Was that you? He nodded shyly. You meant what? She asked. What I said in your dream, he said. That was really me, and I think it every day. You're the most perfect thing in any world. Fane turned to go, but Kaya grabbed him by the arm and pulled him in close. She wrapped her arms around him, and they kissed under the Gaian stars to the sound of the thunderous ocean. Hours later, Kaya walked along the rocks in the now abandoned Gull Cove. There was still a black mark on a large boulder where lightning had struck the hydra vine. She nervously held the sword of Edgard Zieg in her hands after having snuck it out of her father's cabin. Jasper never used it, not enjoying the overwhelming responsibility he felt every time he touched the blade. She had so much to tell Marin, but she wanted to do it in person. Kaya held the old sword and opened herself up to the mental realm. Take me to Marin, she thought. Nothing happened. Kaya concentrated on the energy in the air around her, relaying a massive amount of it into the blade. I want to see Earth, she thought. But again, there was no response. The blade did not glow. It just sat in her hands like a useless antique. Kaya dropped the sword on the rocks and sighed. Every night, she told herself, disappointed. Kaya picked up the sword and began to gather her things to head back to the village. A voice spoke up from behind her, making Kaya jump in surprise. Don't melt, Frost Flower. Kaya jumped around and held out the blade defensively. A blonde woman with purple streaks in her hair sat on the rock in Gull Cove, quietly strumming a ukulele. Any requests? Asked the woman. I can play a mean Paul Simon. Who are you? Asked Kaya. I'm sorry, said the woman. I keep forgetting that we haven't met yet. That's what happens when you dislodge yourself from linear time, I suppose. I'm Allie Zieg, Spiritualist Knight of Thomas's High Seven. How did you get here? Asked Kaya. Frog, said Allie simply. Kaya waited for further explanation, but apparently there was none. Oh. Okay, said Kaya. What are you doing here? Just here to see the frost flower. What's a frost flower, you are about to ask? A frost flower is when thin layers of ice curl from long plants in the autumn or early winter, forming petals made of pure frost. A very rare occurrence in nature. Kaya looked around, seeing no flowers made out of ice. Allie slapped herself on the forehead. I don't mean literally, you normie, she laughed. Kaya, you are the frost flower, a rare occurrence in nature, perhaps the rarest occurrence. You are a Mindbridge. It's not unheard of for two people's minds to overlap in the mental realm. It happens once or twice every generation between those who share similar circumstances. Becoming fully aware of a mind bridge and being able to control it is even rarer, although not unheard of. But for the overlap to happen across the worlds, you and that other girl from Earth are a freaking frost dandelion. Allie grabbed Kaya's face and tilted it, looking into her ear. Is the Earthling in there right now? Amazing! Why do I always forget to bring my camera? You would think I could have foreseen that. Kaya pulled herself away from the woman, her head absolutely swimming with confusion. How do you know this about me? Asked Kaya. And how did you find me? Oh, about 15 cycles ago, I felt tremors in the mental realm, said Allie. Some digging brought me to this island, and I've been popping in and out, keeping an eye on you ever since. 15 cycles? Asked Kaya. That was before I was born. Can you see the future? Allie put down her ukulele and stood up, her blue eyes darting around oddly. Nah, dude, said Allie. She suddenly reached up into the air and grabbed a fly with her bare hands. Allie observed it for a moment and then casually popped the insect into her mouth. Said Kaya. What? Oh, sorry, said Allie. Frog was hungry. She swallowed loudly. Anyway, nobody can see the future clearly. What I can see are the shadows that the tree of time casts upon the ground. I believe that you and Marin have something to do with where the branches are heading. Edgard Zeig's spiritualist knight, Pages Zeig, wrote an apocalyptic folk song about 40 cycles ago, and I think it may have been about you. You might want to hear it. I'll skip the 10-minute free jazz section at the beginning. Allie picked her ukulele back up and began singing. Born in worlds of isolation, they build the bridge toward desolation. She abruptly stopped, held up the ukulele, and it vanished in a cloud of sparkles. The rest of the song is mostly about how much Pages enjoys coffee. That was Desolation with a capital D, by the way. You know, the third world. Or do you know? Have you been licked on the forehead yet or talked to the toaster ghost? Kaya could manage little more than in response. Oh, never mind, said Allie. I'll talk to you in the Hellenic guardianship after Jasper's finger grows back. Bye, places to see. Wait, pleaded Kaya. I'm a mind bridge? Did Gaia pick me for a reason? What am I supposed to do? Oh, stop it with your tired chosen one tropes. Gaia's a force of nature. Do you think I hang out with hurricanes in my spare time? Speak their language? Why is a plant stalk picked to have thin layers of ice curling around it? What does it mean? I don't know. Exactly. You can't say something like that and just leave, said Kaya. Leave? Is that what you think? Asked Allie with a laugh. I was never here, Kaya. Didn't I tell you that yet? I'm projecting my consciousness through the mind of a particularly powerful mentalist frog. She snapped her fingers. Aha! There it is. That's when I say it. Farewell, little frost flower. And with that, the wind blew and scattered Allie's image like dust. She had been replaced with a tiny frog that was sitting on the rock and croaking loudly. Kaya briefly considered waking Thane and telling him what she had just seen, but she decided to keep this moment to herself. Maybe it was better that she had not talked to Marin, Kaya thought with a blush. Perhaps this was a night for secrets. Epilogue. Home. Interstate 95, Earth. Kai awoke on the hyperbus just before it crossed the state line from Vermont to Maine. The driverless vehicle shot down the road at nearly 200 miles per hour, veering around the autocabs with sophisticated precision. As the bus crossed onto the bridge over the Piscataqua River, the old man smiled. He missed his dog, but he knew that his friends in Garfield Park would take care of her until he returned. Every year, Kai managed to scrap together enough money to take this pilgrimage. He closed his eyes contently and found himself thinking about that young girl he had saved in the park. She had been on his mind a lot recently. It was simply too big of a coincidence that Marin Casey would run into him on one of the strangest nights of his life. He had looked for Marin the next day, but the entire Casey family had disappeared and had not been seen in months. The bus stopped in Portland, and Kai was transferred to another bus for the remainder of his trip. 2 hours later, the bus arrived at its destination, and the artificially intelligent tour guide called out to Kai. "We have arrived in Boothbay Harbor, Maine," said the robotic voice. "Enjoy your vacation, Kai. Have you made any interesting plans?" "Family reunion," said Kai. "But first, ice cream." The old man pulled out a few crinkled dollars and bought an orange chocolate ice cream cone on the harbor. He strolled around aimlessly, watching the street musicians, painters, and magicians with mild disinterest. Kai stopped through Orrin's candy store, bought some chocolate, and made his way to a ticket booth that sat by several passenger ships. "Can I help you?" asked the ticket seller skeptically. "We don't have any spare change." Kai laughed and pushed his roll of money under the window. "I'm not here to beg," he said. "I'm a millionaire, can't you tell?" "Oh," said the seller, embarrassed. "Sorry, sir. Where to?" Monhegan Island. Kai's alarm woke him up just past midnight in his room at the Treetop Inn. He made his way out of the hotel and looked toward the night sky. Even all the way out here, the sky had a slightly orange glow that obscured every single star. The old man hiked his way through the pitch-black woods, shivering in the bitter cold as he traversed the familiar landscape. Eventually, he emerged onto the cliffs of Lobster Cove. Kai stood for a moment, listening to the waves crashing against the rocks below. "Home," he whispered. Kai took in a breath of fresh air, sat on the edge of the cliff, and simply waited in meditation for a long time. His mind became dark, and he found peace in that familiar silence. However, something was different about his usual meditations. There was a tiny light in the black abyss of his consciousness, floating as if it was searching for its home. Kai recognized it at once and reached for the light, bringing it into his heart where it flickered and became a raging fire. He opened his eyes urgently and stood up, taking in heavy breaths. Cold rain had begun to fall from the sky, but Kai barely noticed. A sensation was filling his body that he had not felt in a very long time. It couldn't be, he thought. Not here. Kai raised his eyes to the sky, and the rain began to bend and twist around him as it fell. Somewhere in the distance, a bolt of lightning shot from the clouds, arching over the water and towards the cliffs of Lobster Cove. In that same instant, Kai reached out calmly as the blinding light approached. Time seemed to slow down as his reflexes were intensified 1,000-fold. He opened his wrinkled hand and caught the lightning. Gaia. To be continued.
This is the author. Thank you for listening to The Bridge, Scrolling Text Edition, Part 5. Narrated by Alaxandra Luegers, audio engineered by Travis Humbert, artwork by Ashley Ellen Frary, and original music by Joe Luegers. Please consider leaving an honest review of this book on Amazon, Goodreads, or your favorite retailer. It's one of the best things you can possibly do to help an indie author. I'd like to share my upcoming release schedule. A Mindbridge novella, The City and the Island, Scrolling Text Edition, comes out on November 25th. On December 9th, I'll release the second part of my surreal horror novel, The Gears That Watch the Clockmaker. You can view the first part on my channel. And then on December 23rd, I'll be releasing the first part of A Path of Branches, the Mindbridge Trilogy, Book 2. Thanks for listening.